Since the game of rugby began, international teams were principally made up of players selected from local clubs, except for three countries, New Zealand, South Africa and Australia. Players were selected from provincial teams above the club system, and the New Zealand and South African provinces would play regular seasons, helping the All Blacks and Springboks to remain dominant forces for most of the 20th century. And in capital cities with larger groups of players, those provinces became stronger. While in Australia, there were two major provinces that made up the Wallabies, New South Wales and Queensland. Historically, these states played very few games. However, from 1970 onwards, Queensland started to play longer seasons, in some years playing up to 21 games, more than any club or province in the world. Unsurprisingly, Queensland started to win frequently against New South Wales, who were a more historically dominant team. The flow-on effect in the 1980s was that the Wallabies were comprised of Queensland and New South Wales players who had increased shared experience together at the provincial level. By selecting players from only two teams, the Wallabies had a higher level of cohesion than the British home nations and even the All Blacks. This was illustrated by the 1986 Wallaby team that won the Bledisloe Cup in New Zealand for the first time in 37 years. The Wallabies had 9 players from New South Wales and 6 from Queensland. In comparison, the All Blacks had players from 9 different provinces. In contrast, a year later, when the All Blacks beat the Wallabies in Australia, they had selected a team that had 10 players from one provincial team, Auckland. In 1991, when Australia won their first World Cup, the Wallaby team had a combined total of 366 starting caps for Australia. However, their opponents in the final, England, had greater experience with 449. But prior to the World Cup, the New South Wales and Queensland sides had played a total of 24 games. This increased the shared game time between Wallabies, making them more cohesive. But in addition, the Wallabies also had a second level of shared experience, with players in combination positions having played together at their same local club. 2 of these players in the back line had even played together from the age of 12. By comparison, the English team had players from 6 different clubs from the English Club League. In this case, the Wallabies' greater level of cohesion gave them an advantage over a more experienced opponent. There are 3 main ways international rugby teams build cohesion: long-term repetition of selection, extreme consistency of selection prior to a competition, and through high levels of lower cohesion in the feeder teams. Long-term repetition of selection is best shown by England's World Cup winning team of 2003. In the final, the Wallabies had a combined total of 355 starting caps for Australia. However, the English team had a far superior 610. The repetition of selection of the English squad over a 4 to 5 year period had built up their level of cohesion. Extreme consistency in the lead-up is where a team keeps selecting the same squad in a 2-year period before a competition. When South Africa won the 2019 World Cup, 79.6% of their World Cup winning lineup had been selected for the previous 2-year period. In contrast, the Wallabies' percentage was 70.9%, while back in 1999, when they won the final, it was 83.6%. And lastly, an international team achieves cohesion from high levels of lower cohesion in the provincial and club teams that transfers upwards. This is exhibited by the 1999 World Cup winning Wallabies, who were supported by the ACT Brumbies and Queensland Reds. Other examples are the Crusaders, who have had the most cohesive spine in world rugby, providing the foundation for a successful All Blacks team. The influence of cohesion in international rugby is best illustrated in the recent history of the European nations. From 1991 to 2004, the Six Nations was won by either England or France 12 out of 14 times. And in the European Club Championship, an English or French club won 9 out of 10 times. These nations selected players from club competitions, meaning they were drawing from a minimum of 9 feeder teams. With each country structured the same way, England and France were dominant because they had larger numbers of players to choose from. While the Celtic nations did have provincial teams, these provinces played less frequently. But that all changed in 1998. when Ireland's 4 provinces moved into a regular professional competition and rapidly increased their games per season. Wales also made a monumental change in 2004 by reducing from 9 clubs to 4 regional teams. Scotland, with only 2 teams, also joined this competition with Welsh and Irish clubs. All 3 nations now had a smaller number of professional clubs playing a minimum of 30 games per season, increasing shared experience amongst players that would transfer upwards into the national teams. And the effect of these changes was immediate. From 2005 to 2019, Ireland and Wales won the Six Nations 9 out of 15 times, and the European Club Championship was won the most amount of times by an Irish club. But the best example of cohesion playing a factor was in 2008. Wales had recruited a new coach, New Zealander Warren Gatland, who had no shared experience with his playing group. For the Six Nations competition, Gatland selected a Welsh team made up of 13 players from the provincial side Ospreys. That team went through undefeated and became Six Nations champions. After rugby turned professional in 1995, New South Wales and Queensland began to play in the Super Rugby provincial competition against 5 New Zealand and 4 South African teams. A third Australian team, the ACT Brumbies, was added to the competition. However, the Brumbies' core group were made up of a provincial team known as the Kookaburras, who had achieved success at amateur levels and had players with history and shared experience. This made the Brumbies immediately competitive, with them making the final in only their second season. These 3 provincial teams were the key contributing factor to making the Wallabies successful. This factor is valued by the TWI for each team, or the Teamwork Index. The Teamwork Index is a unique metric that measures the quantity and intensity of connections between players in a team. This complex algorithm accounts for shared experiences, player combinations, and the strength of a team's system. But overall, the TWI figure is a key indicator of whether a club has contractual stability, which means how much talent stays and is developed within a club's system. And in 1998, the 3 Australian teams had an average TWI of 95%, a figure far higher than the averages of the South African and New Zealand teams. The TWI of Australia's 3 provincial teams remained the highest during the period in which the Wallabies won their second World Cup in 1999, defeated the British and Irish Lions, and held the Bledisloe Cup for 5 consecutive years. However, that changed in 2006 when Australia expanded to 4 professional teams and added a franchise from Perth called the Western Force. To boost the force, the Queensland Reds lost 12 contracted players, which immediately reduced the built-up cohesion and stability of the Reds. And in 2011, a 5th team was created, the Melbourne Rebels. By expanding the number of provincial teams, Australian rugby had distributed the talent in order to make the 5 teams competitive. However, in doing so, it destroyed the previously established levels of cohesion that was built up over more than 3 decades. Not only did Wallabies have less in-season time together playing at the provincial level, but players began to switch provinces, which would continually undo built-up combinations and create a chaotic level of contractual instability. This had the dramatic effect of Australia going from the most cohesive team in the world to the 8th. And during this time, the Wallabies have lost 17 Bledisloe Cups in a row, suffered consistent home defeats by the British and Celtic nations, and have been unable to win a World Cup. The closest they came was in 2015, when they made the World Cup final, largely due to a TWI bias from New South Wales and a higher consistency in selection of 76.6% in the lead-up. By examining the Wallabies' points percentage against the top-tier nations, it illustrates the decline in their performance. When the Wallabies had 2 teams, their percentage was at its highest, with the figure decreasing with the addition of every new provincial team. And in 2020, the average TWI for all Australian provincial teams is now 54%. And the regularity in which the Wallabies have been defeated by other top nations has been influenced by other countries who have refined their systems and increased their level of cohesion, becoming more competitive. This is how in 2017, the Wallabies lost in Sydney to a Scottish team that had the lowest amount of international experience of all time. The competitive advantage Australian rugby once had of a small professional player base that was more cohesive and centrally stable has been lost, and has been compounded by a recent overseas player drain and a loss-making professional rugby model suffocating the country's capacity to retain and develop talent. This recent history of Australian rugby is a case study of a sporting team that has risen and fallen through the influential factors of team cohesion as measured by TWI, and best explains how the Wallabies went from being the best team in the world to now being in danger of dropping out of the top 10 rugby playing nations.